This is the most important promise any society can make, that if you work hard, your life will be better than your parents' life. For over 100 years, that promise was kept. It was a fact of life. Your parents had it better than their parents, and you would have it better than them. But for the first time since the Industrial Revolution, that promise is broken. If you are a young professional today, you are part of the first generation in over a century that is, by every meaningful measure, poorer than your parents were at the same age. You can work harder, longer, and smarter, and still only aspire to a lifestyle that was considered normal for your mother or father. And here is the most frightening truth of all. This wasn't an accident. This is the direct result of a massive, subtle shift in economics and politics that has systematically worked against you. This isn't about blaming individuals. This is about understanding the fatal flaws in modern economies. Because if we don't understand how this happened, we are doomed to watch the next generation sink even lower. We are going to look at the three biggest, most destructive forces that created this generational economic crisis. We'll look at the policy machine built by the largest generation in history, the collapse of housing affordability, and finally, the dark reason why the coming great wealth transfer won't save anyone. Welcome to the crisis that is defining our economic era. The core problem: a rich world producing poor generations. The contradiction is staring us right in the face. The world is unimaginably richer today than it was in the mid-20th century. Technology is everywhere, global GDP is massive, and we produce goods at an unprecedented rate. And yet, young people are struggling just to achieve basic stability. They can't find reliable jobs that pay a living wage in major cities. They can't afford comfortable homes. They can't start families with any sense of financial security. It used to be a given that when you hit your 20s and 30s, you had access to two key things: affordable education to get started and affordable housing to settle down. But those two things have been systematically dismantled. Let's look at the generation that lived through the sweet spot, the baby boomers. They were born into a period of massive post-war expansion and relative peace. They didn't just have good luck, they had demographic luck. They were, and remain, the largest population cohort in history. And in a democracy, being the biggest group means you have the most voting power and the most consumer power. This allowed them to essentially build a political and economic machine designed to serve their interests at every stage of their lives. This is where the crisis starts. Think about how political power works. If you have a huge block of voters who all want the same thing, politicians will bend over backward to give it to them. The boomers, as the single largest voting bloc, used this power throughout their lives to vote for policies that benefited them, often at the expense of those who came later. When they were young, in the 1960s and 1970s, they voted for systems that helped them climb the ladder. And what did they get? They got low-cost or even free higher education. They benefited from strong social programs and family support systems that helped them raise their kids. In the United States, state funding covered a huge proportion of university costs, keeping tuition cheap. In places like the UK and much of Europe, higher education was often completely state-funded. This meant that the average young boomer could graduate, often without the crushing debt that is an albatross around the necks of today's graduates, and immediately focus on building wealth. This was the first major advantage, a debt-free start. Then, as they moved into the peaks of their careers in the 1980s and 1990s, their priorities changed, and so did their voting patterns. Now, they were firmly established, often owning homes and businesses. What did they want? They wanted to protect their assets. This is when the political landscape started changing drastically. They pushed for lower income taxes. They voted for less business regulation, which they saw as hindering growth, but which also weakened the power of labor and workers' unions, making it harder for the next generation to bargain for higher wages. Crucially, they began to favor domestic industry protections and policies that discouraged outsourcing. This was all about securing their careers and keeping the economy stable for their own prosperity. They protected the value of their investments. But the most fatal shift happened in local government, specifically through zoning laws. This is where things get really deep and descriptive. In the push towards suburban living, boomers often favored strict single-family building requirements. These laws limited density. They mandated how many houses could be built on a given piece of land. The effect was immediate and devastating to housing supply. By preventing denser, multifamily housing, like apartments or townhouses, from being built in desirable areas, they protected the scarcity of the single-family homes they already owned. This wasn't necessarily malicious. It was simple asset protection. But by protecting the value of their home as an investment, they made it exponentially harder for anyone else to buy in. As the boomers moved into retirement, their focus shifted one last time. Now, they are the largest recipients of benefits. So the political pressure is on to support retirement benefits, pension schemes, and expanded medical infrastructure. And what do they vote against? Anything that touches their saved wealth. They overwhelmingly vote to remove wealth taxes, estate taxes, and policies that would reduce the tax effectiveness of retirement accounts, as seen in elections in both the UK and Australia. Look at the cumulative effect. They started debt-free with cheap education. They protected their careers with business-friendly policy. They locked in their generational wealth by limiting housing supply. They protected their retirement through tax policy. This isn't a single unfair choice. It's a lifetime of favorable, systematic policy choices, all made possible because they were the largest group in the room. And it created a ticking time bomb for the next generations. The collapse of housing affordability. The ticking time bomb housing is the single most important part of this entire crisis. It is the place where wealth is built, and it is the place where wealth is currently being destroyed for the young. The video we looked at makes a brilliant point that goes against common sense. It shows that the high interest rates of the 1970s and 1980s were actually better for young people trying to buy a house than today's low rates. Let's break that down because it's the key to understanding this mess. When boomers were buying their first homes, interest rates could be absolutely terrifying, sometimes as high as 15% or more. Yes, their monthly interest payments were high, but that high interest rate acted like a brake pedal on home prices. Why? Because if the interest rate is 15%, no one can afford to borrow $1 million. If you can't afford the monthly payment, the price of the house must come down to meet what people can realistically pay. The high interest rates kept the total principal amount, the sticker price of the house, relatively low and stable. Furthermore, a high interest rate was fantastic for saving. Imagine putting your money in a savings account that pays 10% interest per year. A young couple could save up a down payment in just a few years. The interest on their savings was doing half the work for them. Now, look at the situation today, where interest rates hover around 5% or 6%. That low rate means banks can lend out huge amounts of money. Since the monthly payment is based on a smaller interest percentage, people can afford to borrow an enormous principal amount. This turns into a bidding war. The lower the interest rate, the higher the sticker price of the house can climb, completely detached from what a reasonable value should be. The house price now is 5, 6, 7 times the average income. It has absolutely exploded. The high prices mean that today's young buyer has to pay a massive principal amount over a 30-year period. The boomer buyer in 1985 might have been paying 15% interest, but they were paying it on a principal of only $82,000. Today's young buyer is paying 5% interest on a principal of $430,000, and they still have to pay back that massive principal amount. The sticker shock is the real killer. This has a fatal economic consequence. The video calls real estate an unproductive asset, and that is a powerful idea. A house on a block of land doesn't make anything. It doesn't invent a new technology, start a business, or grow food. It just sits there. When house prices skyrocket, all the money from the productive parts of the economy, the money earned by workers, by new businesses, by people creating value, gets sucked out and trapped in this unproductive asset class. It flows directly to landlords and older homeowners who already own the land. This money is then often used to buy more property, further driving up market values and locking the cycle in place. It's a drain on the entire economic system. The human cost is heartbreaking. Because of housing costs, young people can't move to where the jobs are. If you get offered a fantastic job in a major city, you have to weigh that salary increase against the catastrophic cost of rent or a mortgage. If you decide it's not worth it, a business misses out on a productive worker, and you miss out on a career opportunity. This immobility is documented. The Pew Research study found that over 52% of young American adults between the ages of 18 and 28 still live at home with their parents. They are financially bound to their childhood homes, unable to take the risks that create dynamic, growing economies. This is an absolute collapse of economic mobility. You hear people say, "Don't worry, the young people will be fine. The baby boomers are going to die, and the wealth will all be transferred to the next generation in the great wealth transfer." This sounds comforting, like a cavalry riding in to save the day. But this idea has a fatal flaw. Economists call it the intergenerational wealth problem, but I prefer the name used in the video, the Prince Charles paradox. Here's how it works. For the wealth transfer to actually help the economy, the money needs to go to young people who will use it to invest, buy their first homes, start businesses, and create new jobs. They need to inject the capital into the productive economy. But when do people actually inherit money? The average age of inheritance is not 25. It's not 35. It's usually much later, often when the recipient is in their late 50s or even 60s, approaching the end of their own careers or just starting retirement. When a 60-year-old inherits a large sum of money or a home, they don't use it to start a new tech company. They don't use it to buy a new family home in a place where they can get a better job. No, they use it to fund their own retirement. They pay off their remaining debts, maybe take a nice holiday, and then pass on whatever is left to their own elderly children. Money pooling in the hands of the already old is not money that drives economic growth. It's money for consumption and slow stability. You cannot run a dynamic, functioning economy on people waiting until they are 60 to finally get a break. The capital is stuck. It's a logjam. It's a crisis of timing. A smaller but equally dangerous aspect of this flaw is the problem of family businesses. A lot of the boomer generation's wealth is tied up in small, private family businesses, the local hardware store, the small manufacturing shop, the independent accounting firm. When the owner dies, the business needs a new leader. But the generation that inherits it is often unwilling or unable to run it. If these businesses are simply closed and dissolved, that's a huge loss to the economy. Jobs disappear, community institutions vanish, and economic diversity shrinks. Yes, the inheritors could sell the business, but who buys it? Again, it will likely be an older entrepreneur who has also just received an inheritance and can finally afford the capital. It's money just circulating among the old, never reaching the young, vibrant risk-takers who need the startup capital most. This fatal flaw means that the wealth transfer won't solve the generational problem. It will likely just delay it, ensuring that the next generation also struggles until they too are nearly retired. The frightening truth we have uncovered is that the generational economic crisis is not some inevitable natural disaster. It is a man-made one, created by a lifetime of collective self-interest from the largest generation in history, amplified by policy choices that locked wealth in and priced the young out of basic stability. We saw the power of the boomer policy machine, designed to grant cheap entry when young and protect assets when old. We saw the collapse of housing affordability, where high prices, not high interest rates, are the true enemy, sucking productive wealth into stagnant real estate. And we looked at the doomed promise of the great wealth transfer, the Prince Charles paradox, where the inheritance cavalry arrives 2 decades too late to fuel a dynamic economy. This is a crisis that hits at the very core of what a good society is supposed to be. When the promise of a better life for the next generation is broken, It creates deep social and political cracks. We must understand that simply blaming the boomers is easy, but it doesn't solve anything. We have to look at the structures, the tax codes, and the zoning laws that made their self-interest so incredibly effective. We need to find ways to inject capital back into the hands of the young productive parts of the economy, whether that's through tax reform, wealth taxes, or a complete overhaul of housing policy to allow for high-density affordable development. The clock is ticking. The social contract is doomed to collapse entirely if we don't fix this fundamental imbalance. If you want to understand the solution to this generational economic crisis, hit subscribe.